Today, we're in lesson 4 of our course, Understanding the Old Testament. And this is the first of several lessons on the historical books of the Old Testament. So these would be the books of the Bible from Joshua through Esther. And they chronicle the establishment, the destruction, and the restoration of Israel as a nation. They trace Israel's history from the first days of conquering Canaan through the spiritually trying times of the judges and the kings and the divided nation to the people's exile and return. Figure 1, this is on page 1 of your worksheet, gives an overview of what we have studied thus far, as well as what we will be studying in this section of the course. Now, if you haven't gotten that worksheet yet, you'll find a link in the description of this lesson where you can download a copy of that PDF. And you don't have to print it out or anything. You can work directly from that worksheet on your device. And we will end the lesson then by looking over the questions that are presented to you in that worksheet. Last time, we looked at Israel's early years. So we began with Exodus, which was the escape from Egypt. Then we looked at Leviticus, the prescription for living, Numbers, the prescription for traveling, and Deuteronomy, the centrality of the covenant. Today, we will be looking at conquest and life in Canaan. We'll be going through Joshua, looking at conquering Canaan, Judges, which tells us about settling Canaan, and Ruth, which talks a lot about providential grace. I will also be assigning you some more homework for the week, but before we do any of that, let's set the stage for our transfer from Israel's early years. Moses' exhortations throughout Deuteronomy had been clear. Be faithful to God. Keep him central to every aspect of life. And in doing this, you will be blessed. However, if you turn away from him, if you reject his authority, he will turn you over to your enemies. Now, had the Israelites remembered these key principles, then their years of entering and settling in Canaan would have been far more peaceful and far less unpredictable. Yet as the years passed, the people forgot the words of Moses, and they became more interested in their own pursuits than in the pursuits of their God. Despite the Israelites' unfaithfulness, however, God himself remained faithful. Although he punished the Israelites, he also raised up godly people such as Joshua and Deborah, Jephthah, Samuel, and David. These people would lead Israel back to the worship of the one true God. And as the story of Ruth illustrates so beautifully, these first few historical books show the blessing that comes from remaining faithful to God and loving him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Looking first at Joshua and its authorship, some internal biblical evidence indicates that Joshua did not write certain sections of this book. However, Joshua 24, verse 26 suggests that Joshua wrote at least part of the book, and Jewish tradition names Joshua as the author. This is what we read in this verse. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. The account of Joshua's death in Joshua 24, 29 through 31 clearly indicates another author besides Joshua, at least for this section. This is what it says. After these days, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. The Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. When we look at all of the evidence, it seems reasonable to conclude that much of the book comes from eyewitness accounts, perhaps from Joshua's own hand. The common phrase, until this day, which is found in chapter 4, verse 9, chapter 5, verse 9, chapter 7, verse 26, and so on, suggests an extended amount of time has elapsed since the events described, though not necessarily an extremely long time. The mention of Jebusites in Jerusalem in chapter 1563 suggests a date prior to 1000 BC when David conquered Jerusalem and drove out the Jebusites, as seen in 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10. The reference to Canaanites in Gezer in 1610 implies a date prior to about 970 BC when the king of Egypt conquered Gezer and gave it to Solomon, as mentioned in 1 Kings 3:1 and 9:16. Furthermore, the historical references suggest the book was in its present form no later than Solomon's time. Looking now at the theme and purpose of Joshua. Joshua, as leader of the nation of Israel, appears to be the main human character of the book. After Moses' death, Joshua led Israel in crossing the Jordan River, and they began to conquer the people of Canaan and settled in the land as their new home. The book covers about 25 to 30 years of Israel's history. The theme and purpose of the book of Joshua is to demonstrate three things. First of all, God kept his promise to Abraham involving the land of Canaan. Second, God, though very rich in mercy, eventually judges sin as an act of justice. And third, God judges sin in all nations, in Canaan as well as in Israel. Looking at the setting and conditions in Canaan, God's judgment on the Canaanites came after many years of mercy. Men like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had built altars to the true God there. Israel's patriarchs demonstrated to the Canaanites the worship of the one true God. Yet the Bible indicates that at the time of Abraham, the sins of the Amorites were not yet complete. We see this in Genesis 15:16. While the Israelites tarried in Egypt for 400 years, the Canaanites became more evil. The peoples of Canaan had turned away from God and created their own idols. The Canaanites were polytheistic. This means that they worshipped many different gods, but their chief god was El, who is called Father, Bull, and Creator. They also worshipped Asherah, the wife of El, and called El's chief son Baal, which means Lord. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 18. They thought that Baal reigned as king of the gods and that he controlled heaven, earth, and childbirth. A Canaanite city was often built on a hill with a tall, thick wall around it to make the city secure. The ruler of a city governed both the city and the surrounding area, and people in a walled-in city like this could fight off an enemy for a long time as long as they had enough food and water. As a result, it seemed difficult for the Israelites to succeed in conquering Canaan. However, the people of Israel had God on their side. The cruel and evil nature of these gods was reflected in the Canaanites' religious customs. Archaeologists believe that they sacrificed their children, consorted with religious prostitutes, and worshipped snakes. Moses was deeply aware that the Canaanites could and would lead Israel into sin, so he warned the Israelites to destroy these wicked people completely. The war between Israel and Canaan was God's tool of judgment on the Canaanites. Through the conquest of Canaan, God took back the land that belonged to him and judged those who chose not to honor him. Now, I want to mention something here, because this is one of those areas where skeptics and those who are against the Bible will protest and will say that God was vengeful and wrathful and all of these things for destroying the Canaanites. But God gave them much time to repent. And after a prolonged season of unrepentance and wickedness, God had no other choice but to destroy them. The next thing that we can look at is Joshua the person. According to Numbers 13:16, Joshua was first called Hoshea, which means Yahweh has saved. But Moses changed his name to Joshua, a Hebrew word that means the Lord is salvation. The name Jesus comes from the Greek form of a shortened version of this word. Joshua was a well-trained leader. Having once been a slave in Egypt, he witnessed the miracles that God performed in delivering Israel. Joshua was present with Moses and participated in several key developments in the unfolding of the Old Testament story. Before Moses died, he laid his hands on Joshua, and God's Spirit came upon Joshua, enabling him and empowering him to lead Israel. In Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 through 23, we read, "So the Lord said to Moses, 'Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so the whole Israelite community will obey him. He is to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. At his command, he and the entire community of the Israelites will go out, and at his command they will come in.' Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole assembly. Then he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord instructed through Moses." In Deuteronomy 34:9 we read, "Now Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses." I have placed the outline of Joshua in your worksheet. It can be broken into 3 parts. So part 1, this is chapter 1 through 4, They are entering Canaan. Joshua becomes the leader. 2 spies go to Jericho. There's the crossing of the Jordan and setting up a memorial. In part 2, they're conquering Canaan. So this is chapter 5 through chapter 12. We see, first of all, them preparing for the battles. Then we see the central battles. This is between Jericho and Ai. The southern battles with Amorite allies. The northern battles with Canaanite allies. And a summary of the victories. Then in part 3, we see the settling of Canaan. And this is a lengthy part covering chapter 13 through chapter 24. So it starts off with the plan for dividing, followed by the place for each tribe. It shows the cities for Levites and for refuge. And it ends with a farewell and the death of Joshua. So let's look at each of these. First of all, Joshua chapters 1 through 4 tells us about Israel's entering Canaan. At God's appointed time, Israel entered the promised land. The divine promise of success in conquering Canaan depended on obedience to the given law. Therefore, Joshua began to lead the nation of Israel under the authority and presence of God. Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho on the west side of the Jordan River. From a woman named Rahab, the spies learned that the Canaanites were afraid of Israel. Word of God's great power had reached the people of Canaan, and they knew that God had assisted Israel in winning many battles. And Rahab demonstrated great faith in God as she hid the spies in her house until they were safe. As a result of this, her life was later spared when the entire city of Jericho was destroyed. After the spies returned to Joshua with their report, a divine miracle facilitated the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. Each tribe carried 1 large stone out of the river, and Joshua used the stones to build a memorial. This was a reminder that God had rolled back the waters of the Jordan. Joshua chapters 5 through 12 tell us about Israel's conquering Canaan. The book of Joshua vividly describes the battles that Israel fought, which are generally divided into the central battles, the southern battles, and the northern battles. Now, you should be aware of the fact that some scholars outline the battles and the chapters differently than the outline that we use for this course. Joshua's military strategy has been admired as a model of intelligence and efficiency. Simply put, it was one of divide and conquer. Canaan consisted of 2 major power blocks, the Amorites to the south and the Canaanites to the north. If Joshua could drive a wedge between them, he could prevent their forming an alliance against him and thus could dispose of them each in turn. But this wedge could be made only by first penetrating into Canaan's central highlands. This was a task that required bringing Jericho and other strongholds under Israelite control. 2 famous biblical stories occur in the central campaign. The first conveys the defeat of the city of Jericho through the unusual means of marching around the city and blowing trumpets. The second story describes the defeat of the city of Ai and the sin of Achan. Now, Achan's sin caused Israel to lose the first battle with Ai. When the sin was dealt with, however, God granted Israel the victory. The Israelites' successful central campaign led to their deception by the Gibeonites, who formed coalitions to protect themselves. Joshua foolishly made a pact with them without first consulting God. All leaders in the Bible, while having good leadership qualities, sometimes made wrong decisions. And Joshua's error was unfortunate because just prior to the defeat of Jericho, the Lord revealed to Joshua that because the battle was his, only his methods could bring success. When Joshua discovered the truth, he made the citizens of Gibeon slaves, cursing them to serve as woodcutters and water carriers. Later, when Gibeon was attacked, Israel came to fight and destroy the Amorites. During the battle, Joshua prayed that the sun would stand still, and God granted his request. This is what we read in chapter 10, verses 13 and 14. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Having promised Joshua victory in this battle, the Lord also hurled large hailstones on the Amorites, killing many of them. In the central battles, then, Israel defeated Jericho and Ai. The southern battles involved the Gibeonites' deception of Israel and the defeat of the Amorites. In the northern battles, Joshua turned his attention to defeating the Canaanites and destroying the city of Hazor. Although Israel did not fully comply with Moses' instruction to remove all of the Canaanites, they did take possession of all of the land. Finally, in Joshua chapters 13 through 24, the remainder of the book describes the division of the land and its settlement. With the exception of the Levites, each tribe received its own area of Canaan in which to settle. As priests and ministers serving the Lord, the Levites lived in 48 cities across the nation. The city of Shiloh became the religious center for Israel, and they set up the tabernacle there. Part of the land division also involved the settlement of 6 cities of refuge, with 3 on the east side and 3 on the west side of the Jordan River. For many years, the Israelites enjoyed peace from their enemies and followed the Lord their God. Before Joshua died, he called all Israel together and spoke a farewell. He reminded them that God had called Abraham out of idolatry and warned them always to fear and obey God. The people pledged to serve God and obey him. And that brings us to Judges. While the theme of the land settlement continues in the book of Judges, the Judges account emphasizes how much of the land was not conquered. It tells how most of the tribes failed to take over their territories. The book begins with a rather lengthy summary of the conquest of the land of Canaan and details an impulsive time in Israel's history. Determining the human author of the book of Judges is difficult due to a lack of internal evidence in both the book itself and the complete biblical text. As a result, many conservative scholars have concluded that the author is anonymous. Now, there is some evidence that Samuel may have authored the book. According to the Babylonian Talmud, Samuel wrote Judges as well as 1st and 2nd Samuel. Inasmuch as everything in the book chronologically precedes Samuel's death, this is a reasonable suggestion. However, the book itself offers no clue to its authorship, nor is there internal witness to it elsewhere in the Bible. In light of this, it seems best to leave it as an anonymous composition. The statement, "In those days Israel had no king," occurs 4 times in the book of Judges. in chapter 17, verse 6, chapter 18, verse 1, chapter 19, verse 1, and chapter 21, verse 25. It suggests that Judges was written after Saul became king in 1050 BC. Since David took Jerusalem away from the Jebusites about 1000 BC, according to 2 Samuel 5:7, it's possible that Judges was written between 1050 and 1000 BC. The title of the book describes those who ruled after Joshua. While it appears that some of the judges ruled simultaneously, we have to remember that the book of Judges covers approximately 325 years from 1375 to 1050 BC. After this period, Eli and Samuel each served 40 years as judge and priest. Taking this into account, one could say that the period of Judges lasted about 400 years, as did the period of the kings. During those 400 years, Israel was a group of tribes, and each tribe governed itself. Like Joshua, the outline of Judges is broken into 3 sections or 3 segments, and I've also placed it in your worksheet. First, you have chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6, which talks about the conditions in the time of the judges. So the areas that were not conquered, as well as Israel's cycle of failure. Then you have 6 major judges who delivered Israel, which we'll talk more about in just a minute, but this covered chapter 3, verse 7 through chapter 16, verse 31. Finally, you have a time of confusion in chapter 17 through chapter 21. So you have Micah and his idolatry, you have the Danites and their relocation, and you have the sin and civil war that broke out in chapter 19 through 21. So let's look at these closer. First, there are the conditions in Israel that we read about in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6. The book of Judges serves 2 purposes. First, it records the history of Israel between Joshua and Samuel. And second, it reveals the spiritual cycle of Israel in Canaan. Israel consistently refused to obey God and became enamored with idols and with immorality. As a result, God sent other nations to conquer them. Then, after some years of slavery, Israel would cry out to God for deliverance, and God would honor their prayer by sending deliverers, or judges. Although they would return to God and worship Him for a time, they would soon return to idolatry and continuous sin, restarting this devastating cycle. In the book of Joshua, God had instructed Israel to remove all their enemies from the land, but they failed to fully obey. Some Canaanites remained in the land and caused God's people many problems. We see this in Judges 2, verse 1 through 3. Although at times the Canaanites worked for Israel and even paid taxes, whenever the Israelites turned away from God, their enemies conquered them. In Judges 3:7 through 16:31, we read about the judges and Abimelech. Figure 2 on your worksheet shows the 6 minor judges and the 6 major judges. In the context of this period of Israel's history, the word judges refers not so much to those who presided over trials at court, but rather to men and women raised up by the Spirit of God to establish and maintain domestic law and order, adherence to covenant principles, and deliverance from foreign oppression. They were chosen arbitrarily by the Lord with no particular notice given of their qualifications or even their character. Their office, furthermore, was not hereditary. A judge's child could not automatically succeed him or her in office. The point is that the Lord alone is king, and he alone can and does choose the most surprising channels through whom to administer his dominion. Looking at a little history of the 6 major judges, we see Othniel, who brought deliverance from Mesopotamia. Like his uncle Caleb, Othniel was anointed by the Spirit of the Lord, who enabled him to war against the king of Aram and to secure 40 years of peace for Israel. Then we see Ehud, who brought deliverance from Moab. Commissioned to present a tribute to the king of Moab, Ehud, a left-handed man, hid a double-edged sword under his clothing and killed the king when they were alone. The Moabite king was so obese that his fat closed over the sword, including the hilt. Before the king's servants could discover his death, Ehud escaped and rallied the Israelites to conquer Moab. Deborah and Barak brought deliverance from Canaan. When Deborah prophesied that God would give Canaan's army into Barak's hand, Barak insisted that Deborah accompany him. As a result, Deborah told him that a woman would receive the honor for ensuring the defeat. Barak and his men fought and defeated Canaan, but the commander of the Canaanite army escaped to the tent of Heber the Kenite and his wife Jael. After giving the commander food and drink, Jael killed him while he slept by driving a tent peg through his temple. Deborah and Barak celebrated the victory with a song. Gideon brought deliverance from Midian. Now, one notable aspect of Gideon's story is the number of times that he asks for and or receives confirmation and encouragement from God. To verify who he was, the Lord consumed Gideon's offering with fire. Twice, God confirmed his promise of deliverance through Gideon's fleece and the adjacent ground. Knowing Gideon's fear, the Lord sent him and his servant to overhear a Midianite's dream and the prophecy of Israel's victory. Despite Gideon's foolish decisions later on, the Lord used his leadership to deliver the Israelites from their oppression under Midian. Jephthah brought deliverance from Ammon. Because Jephthah was the offspring of his father's illegitimate affair, his brothers drove him away from the family. However, when Jephthah later became a mighty warrior, these same brothers sought his help in fighting the Ammonites and promised to make him leader over all of Gilead. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah as he went into battle, and he conquered the enemies. Before the fight, Jephthah had vowed that if victorious, he would offer as a sacrifice to God whatever came out of his house to meet him. When his daughter, his only child, came out to greet him, Jephthah was in anguish, yet he had no choice but to fulfill his vow and sacrifice his daughter. Now, there has been a lot of debate surrounding this account and exactly what happened here. Many have taken this to mean that Jephthah offered his daughter's life to the Lord, claiming the sacred nature of an oath made to the Lord. In addition, they note that a burnt offering involves a sacrifice of the life. They justify it on the grounds that a vow to God takes precedence over all else, even human life. God is sovereign over life and takes it if he wishes, as he does eventually. Now, others however, hold that it is not necessary to assume that Jephthah ever offered a human sacrifice. First, Jephthah was aware of the law against human sacrifice. He would have known this would have been a blatant rejection of God's law. Second, the text does not actually say that he killed his daughter in a sacrificial offering. This is simply inferred by some from the fact that he promised that whatever came out of the house first will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Paul indicated that we are to be offered to God as a living sacrifice. Jephthah could have offered his daughter to the Lord as a living sacrifice for the remainder of her life. She would serve the Lord in the temple and remain a virgin. This would have been a tremendous sacrifice in the Jewish context of that day. This view is supported by the fact that she went out to weep for 2 months, mourning not her death, but her virginity. Samson brought deliverance from Philistia. Samson is perhaps one of the better known judges because of his unusual strength, yet weakness for Philistine women. The Spirit of the Lord gave Samson strength to do many things, including tearing a lion apart with his bare hands, striking 30 men from Ashkelon, and using a donkey's jawbone to kill 1,000 men. After falling prey to the Philistines' schemes through Delilah, Samson prayed for supernatural strength one last time, and the Lord enabled him to push a temple's pillars so that the building collapsed, killing himself as well as thousands of Philistines. The remaining leader is Abimelech, also known as the anti-judge, because he was the opposite of the other judges that God appointed. Unlike the 6 major judges, he did not deliver Israel from any enemies, and unlike the 6 minor judges, his story is given an entire chapter, Judges chapter 9. Finally, Judges 17 through 21 shows us a great time of confusion. The final 5 chapters are sometimes considered appendixes. They narrate 2 horrific occurrences that illustrate one of the darkest periods of Israel's national history: Micah and the migration of Dan, and the rape of the Levites' concubine and the subsequent intertribal war. Here we read of idolatry, conspiracy, senseless violence, and sexual immorality. The statement, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit," aptly describes this period of Israel's history. Finally, we have Ruth. While Judges ends on a negative note, Ruth presents a positive story of lavish grace and providence in the midst of tragic life circumstances. The story centers around 3 primary individuals: Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, though many consider Ruth to be the main character of the book. Ruth was a godly woman from the land of Moab. While the law forbade her to be part of the nation of Israel, her story demonstrates that God's mercy is extended to every nation. Ruth, like Rahab, was a Gentile, and both were ancestors of the Jewish Messiah. Looking at the authorship of Ruth, as with Judges, the book of Ruth contains no internal evidence concerning the author, but Jewish tradition seems to attribute its authorship to Samuel. The attachment of the book of Ruth to the book of Judges in the 22-book arrangement of the Hebrew Bible implies common authorship or compilation of the two books, supported by the Babylonian Talmud as well. There's no reason to reject the Jewish tradition that Samuel was responsible for the whole, though admittedly there is no explicit internal evidence to support it. Looking at the setting of Ruth, from the beginning phrase of Ruth 1:1, in the days when the judges ruled, we know that the story of Ruth comes from the time of the judges. It opens as a Jewish couple, Elimelech and Naomi, are leaving Judah because famine has forced them to look for food. They travel to Moab, a nation east of the Dead Sea. The Hebrew names Elimelech and Naomi are rich in their meaning. Elimelech means God is my king, while Naomi means pleasant. Ironically, many of Naomi's life experiences were not pleasant, but very bitter. Elimelech died in Moab along with their two sons who had married Moabite women. In fact, when she eventually returned to Israel, Naomi said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitter. However, the story of Naomi and Ruth reveals that God is the sovereign king over all and extends his mercy to all, specifically those who experience great suffering. In Ruth, the 4 chapters are written almost like a 4-act play. Each chapter or scene has a clear opening and concluding paragraph, and each revolves around an important dialogue. The chapters are organized around a problem-solution framework. The outline of Ruth is in your worksheet and can be outlined as follows. First, Naomi and Ruth move from Moab to Bethlehem in chapter 1. In chapter 2, Ruth meets Boaz in his field. In chapter 3, Ruth talks with Boaz at his threshing floor. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 17, Boaz redeems and marries Ruth. And then in chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, we see the genealogy, the messianic line, is traced from Perez to David. So let's look at the 4 acts. Act 1 would be from Moab to Bethlehem. Ruth 1 describes Naomi's becoming a widow with no children. Naomi encouraged her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to remain in Moab while she prepared to return home. Although Orpah agreed and stayed with her people and her gods, Ruth refused to leave Naomi. In her impassioned speech, she pledged, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Naomi consented, and Ruth accompanied her back to Bethlehem. Act 2 takes place in Boaz's field. After their return, Ruth went out to glean. This was gathering grain left by the reapers, so that she and Naomi would have something to eat. Now, the Israelite law commanded the harvesters to leave some grain around the edges of the field for the poor, the widows, and the non-Jews living among them, all of which described Ruth. God's providence led Ruth to glean in the field of Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi. He was second in the genealogical line as Ruth's kinsman redeemer. The purpose of the kinsman redeemer was to protect the interests of needy members of the immediate family as well as other relatives. Responsibilities included marrying a widow and providing an heir for a brother who had died. redeeming or buying back land that a poor relative had sold to somebody outside the family, redeeming a relative who had been sold into slavery, and avenging the killing of a relative. Act 3 takes place with Boaz at his threshing floor. The author describes Naomi's counsel to Ruth to express interest in marrying Boaz, her kinsman redeemer. As Boaz was sleeping at the threshing floor to protect his crops, Ruth lay nearby at his feet to demonstrate that she wanted to marry him. Boaz agreed by spreading the corner of his garment over her. This was a cultural custom that symbolized his willingness to marry, protect, and care for her. Finally, Act 4 tells of kinsman redemption and the messianic line. Ruth 4 recounts the transaction of buying back the property Naomi had sold. After meeting with the nearest kinsman redeemer, Boaz bought the property, returned it to Elimelech's family, and married Ruth. Boaz and Ruth had a son named Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who was the father of King David. Through David, God established the lineage to which the Messiah and our own kinsman redeemer came. Through Jesus, God's mercy and grace in Ruth's life extends all the way to believers today. Now, before we review our lesson, let's look at your homework for the week. So, homework for the week, you are to read one of the books that we talked about today. So this would be Joshua, Judges, or Ruth. Now, like I mentioned before, you can read all of them if you want. Take your time, read them, really understand them. Don't just check them off of your to-do list. Follow the outline for the specific book in the worksheet to break up your reading. If it takes you longer than a week, that's perfectly fine. If you choose to use an audio Bible, that's perfectly fine as well. Looking at our lesson review, question 1, who wrote the book of Joshua? This would be eyewitnesses, including Joshua himself. Question 2, what is the main theme and purpose of Joshua? God kept his promise to Abraham involving the land of Canaan. God, though rich in mercy, eventually judges sin as an act of justice, and God judges sin in all nations. Question 3, what were the physical and religious conditions in Canaan? A Canaanite city was often built on a hill and had a tall, thick wall around it to help make the city secure. The evil nature of the many gods the Canaanites worshipped was reflected in their religious customs. Question 4, who wrote Judges, and what time frame was it written in, and what does it cover? Well, it was an anonymous composition written between 1050 and 1000 BC, and it covers approximately 325 years from 1375 to 1050 BC. Question 5, who wrote the book of Ruth? Jewish tradition seems to attribute the writing of Ruth to Samuel. Question 6, what does the story of Naomi and Ruth reveal? This story reveals that God is sovereign over all and extends his mercy to all.